March 19th, 1943. Washington, D.C. The rain had been relentless, drumming against the windows of the State Department's dimly lit offices. Inside, beneath the sterile glow of harsh fluorescent lights, Patricia Wills, a young typist, was lost in the rhythmic tapping of her fingers against the worn keys of her Underwood typewriter. The room was silent, save for the occasional shuffle of papers or the distant murmur of officials arguing over the latest intelligence reports. She wasn't supposed to notice the thing she noticed. She wasn't supposed to care about the document she typed, those bundles of paper filled with numbers and letters that seemed to blend into one monotonous blur of national security jargon. But on that particular day, something was different. The document she had been handed was unremarkable at first glance. It was a standard dispatch from a field agent station overseas, nothing that would spark the interest of anyone working in the department. It was just another routine update. Yet, as she read through the page, a strange unease began to grow in the pit of her stomach. The sentences didn't quite align. Some words didn't seem to fit in the context of the report. She could feel her brow furrow as she scanned the lines again, her fingers hesitating above the keys. The message was encoded, but there was something off about it, something subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't the usual cipher she had grown used to typing in her time at the department. Patricia paused, her breath catching in her throat. She had no training in cryptography. She wasn't an expert in encryption. She was just a typist, assigned to transcribe intelligence memos that others would analyze. But she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was hidden in the document, something the experts had missed. She leaned in closer, the dim light casting long shadows over her work. The characters on the page began to take on a new meaning. Her mind, unburdened by the rigidity of official intelligence protocols, seemed to wander into uncharted territory. It was as if the words on the page were speaking to her, a pattern emerging where there had once been only chaos. The word simplicity leapt out from the jumble of letters and numbers, and for a moment, Patricia thought she had misread it. But the more she stared at the document, the more the letters appeared to be arranged in a way that couldn't be a coincidence. The letters weren't random. There was a code hidden beneath the surface, a structure no one had bothered to look for. She had no idea what it meant, but she could feel the weight of it in her hands. Patricia knew she had stumbled upon something significant. Her heart raced as she placed the paper down carefully, looking around the room to see if anyone had noticed her growing unease. The hum of conversation from other desks seemed distant, like a world apart. No one cared what a typist thought, let alone a woman who had only recently been assigned to this department after her husband had been drafted into the war. The world outside these walls was embroiled in conflict, and the decisions being made here would affect the lives of millions. But Patricia, a quiet observer in the midst of it all, knew one thing with absolute certainty. The system had overlooked something, and she had found it. She glanced at her supervisor, a senior officer named Colonel Edward Finch. He was busy scribbling notes, his face stern, eyes fixed on the reports in front of him. Patricia hesitated. She had no formal training in cryptography. She was a mere cog in the machine of government bureaucracy. If she brought this to him, she risked being dismissed. He would likely tell her that it was nothing, just another typist imagining things. After all, she was just a woman in a room full of men who had spent their entire careers in intelligence. What could she possibly know about the intricacies of code breaking? But Patricia couldn't shake the feeling that this was important. This feeling was unlike any she had experienced before. It was the kind of quiet conviction that whispered to you in the dead of night, urging you to act when all logic told you to stay still. She folded the paper and slipped it into her drawer. If she was wrong, no one would ever know. But if she was right, the following days passed in a blur. Patricia continued to type the reports, her mind never straying far from the document she had hidden away. She spent her lunch breaks reading up on encryption techniques, browsing books on basic cryptography, and searching through any resources she could find. She couldn't make sense of the code, but she was determined to understand it. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was close, just out of reach. It was nearly a week before she found the courage to approach someone. The person she chose was a junior analyst named Samuel Johnson, a man she had heard discussing his theories on military intelligence in the break room. He wasn't high-ranking, but he had a reputation for being sharp, for seeing things that others overlooked. She felt a flicker of hope that he might be able to see what she had seen. Patricia walked up to him, her hands trembling as she handed him the folded document. "I think there's something here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel studied her for a moment, then took the paper from her. His eyes flicked over the text, and his brow furrowed. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "This is unconventional," he said slowly, his voice measured. "But it doesn't look like any code I've seen before. It's almost like a puzzle." Patricia felt her pulse quicken. Could it be possible? Was this really a break in code? "Can you make sense of it?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Samuel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and motioned for her to follow him. "We'll need to show this to someone higher up," he said, his tone still cautious. As they walked through the maze of corridors, Patricia's mind raced. She had been right to trust her instincts. Something had been hidden in plain sight, and now, perhaps, someone would finally listen. June 2nd, 1944. London, England. The war had reached a grim stalemate, a drawn-out battle that seemed to bleed into eternity. The relentless fog of conflict hung over the city, muffling the sounds of everyday life. In a small, dimly lit room beneath the streets, a group of mathematicians and cryptographers sat hunched over stacks of paper, their faces weary from days without sleep. Helen Ashford, a quiet, intense woman in her 30s, studied a set of numbers with an almost obsessive focus. Her fingers moved methodically over a series of calculations, the hum of a nearby typewriter providing the only background noise. The room smelled of old books and stale coffee, the air thick with the weight of secrets. This wasn't a military headquarters or a top-secret government office. This was a makeshift cryptography lab, hidden in the labyrinthine heart of London's underground. The team assembled here had one singular goal: to crack the enemy's codes. They were outsiders, amateurs, in the eyes of the establishment. Yet they had been entrusted with a task no one else could solve. Helen's eyes darted from one piece of paper to another, her mind racing to connect the dots. She wasn't supposed to be here. Women weren't supposed to be here. She had no formal training in intelligence work, no background in military operations. She had been a mathematician before the war, someone who solved equations for a living. But when the call came, when the need for anyone with even a hint of cryptographic ability arose, Helen had answered. She had come to London on a whim, taking a risk that most people would have found absurd. In a world dominated by men, where every step she took was scrutinized, Helen knew that she was more than just an anomaly. She was a puzzle, a contradiction. A woman whose only claim to this world was her sheer determination and a sharp mind that refused to be ignored. It was through this mindset that she found herself staring at a particular document one night, one piece of a larger puzzle. The document had been smuggled in from Washington, D.C., by an anonymous source who had heard whispers of a critical flaw in the enemy's codes. At first glance, it appeared to be just another routine transmission. But to Helen's trained eye, there was something off about it. A pattern was beginning to emerge, a subtle, almost imperceptible clue hidden beneath the surface. Her fingers hovered over the cryptographic machine, her breath held in anticipation. The clock on the wall ticked away, each second carrying with it the weight of life and death. If she was wrong, if this was just another dead end, the Allies would lose time, precious time that they could not afford. But if she was right, if she cracked this code, it could shift the tide of the war. Helen's heart pounded as she traced the sequence of numbers across the page once again. Her mind raced, connecting the dots in ways that no one else had yet considered. This wasn't just a message. It was a map, a set of instructions, a pathway through the enemy's communications that had been overlooked by every other cryptographer in the business. The symbols, the order of the numbers, they all made sense, but only if you knew how to read them. Only if you were willing to look beyond the obvious. She sat back, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "It's not just about the numbers," she murmured to herself. almost as if speaking aloud would help clarify the thoughts swirling in her head. It's about what they're not saying, the gaps between the words, the spaces, the pauses. One of her colleagues, Thomas, who sat at the adjacent desk, looked over at her. He had been working with her for weeks, and though he didn't fully understand her approach, he had learned to trust her instincts. He raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "What is it, Helen?" he asked quietly, his voice low but filled with curiosity. "I think I've found something," she said, her voice steady but filled with excitement. "This isn't just a code, it's a form of misdirection. A series of dead ends designed to confuse anyone trying to break through. But if we reverse engineer it, if we break it down step by step, we can uncover what they're hiding." Thomas leaned in closer, his expression growing more serious. "You're saying that we've been looking at it all wrong?" Helen nodded, tapping the paper in front of her. "Exactly. They want us to think it's one thing, but it's really something entirely different." The rest of the team gathered around her desk, peering over her shoulder at the intricate patterns she had uncovered. For a brief moment, the room seemed to fall into a stunned silence. They had all been trained to spot the smallest clue, the tiniest discrepancy, but even they couldn't see it until Helen pointed it out. "That's brilliant," said Samuel, a young cryptographer who had been a part of the team for only a few weeks, but had already proven himself to be an invaluable asset. "If we can reverse the encryption here, we could potentially decipher the entire transmission. But it'll take time, and we don't have much of it." Helen glanced at the clock again, her mind moving faster than the seconds ticking away. "We don't have a choice. If we don't crack it now, they'll send out another set of instructions, and we'll be right back where we started." The window is closing. The team went to work in a flurry of activity. Helen directed the effort, her calm presence guiding the others through the complex steps of decoding the transmission. It was a painstaking process, one that involved hours of trial and error, frustration, and moments of near despair. The air in the room grew thick with tension as they tried different permutations, adjusting the settings on their cryptographic machines, recalibrating their calculations. Outside, the sounds of London's war-torn streets seemed to fade away, swallowed by the intensity of the task at hand. The battle was no longer just a matter of military might. It was a battle of wits, of intelligence against intelligence. And Helen, for the first time in her life, felt as if she had found her place in the world, right at the center of it. By the early hours of the morning, the team had made a breakthrough. The encryption had been reversed, and the hidden message began to take shape. It was a set of coordinates, precise locations of enemy supply routes, hidden bunkers, and secret meeting points. Helen's heart skipped a beat as she realized what this meant. If they could send the information back in time, it could shift the entire balance of the war. It was the kind of victory that could change everything. But just as the team began to breathe a sigh of relief, a familiar voice rang out from the doorway. "What are you all doing in here?" Helen's pulse quickened. The question had come from Colonel James, the senior officer who had dismissed their work from the very beginning. His gaze swept across the room, landing on the decoding machine that now hummed with the fruit of their labor. His eyes narrowed. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice cold. Helen stood up, her hands trembling. "We've cracked the code, Colonel. We found the enemy's plans." Colonel James stepped forward, his face hardening as he glanced at the decrypted message. He didn't say a word. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the team to wonder. Would their discovery be celebrated, or would it be buried under the weight of bureaucracy? November 11th, 1947. Washington, D.C. The world had changed. The war was over, but its echoes still resonated in the hallways of the government buildings and the lives of those who had been caught in its grip. Patricia Wills, the young typist whose discovery had been buried in the layers of bureaucracy, sat at her desk once again. It was the same desk in the same office, though nothing was the same anymore. The typewriter sat before her, a silent witness to the years that had passed. But her fingers did not move. The war had ended, and yet it felt as though her own battle was far from over. She stared out of the window, watching the traffic pass by. The city was alive, bustling with energy, but it felt distant, like a world she no longer belonged to. Her mind wandered back to that fateful day in 1943 when she had stumbled across the cryptic message, a discovery that she had believed would change everything. She had been so certain then, certain that her moment had come, that the world would listen to her. She had been wrong. The memory of her encounter with Colonel Finch haunted her still. After she had handed him the encrypted document, she had waited for the recognition she had been certain would follow. But instead, she had been met with indifference. His dismissal had been swift, professional, and cold. The matter was brushed aside as nothing more than a typist's wild imagination. Her discovery, buried beneath the weight of institutional bureaucracy, was never taken seriously. Patricia had tried to fight it. She had sought out Samuel Johnson, the junior analyst who had seemed to believe her, but his influence was limited. The machine of government, with its complex web of power, was not easily swayed by one typist's hunch. The months that followed were a blur of frustration and helplessness. Every time she thought she might be heard, she was silenced again. She could feel the walls closing in, the system grinding her down, as the critical information she had uncovered was lost in the shuffle of the war's chaotic aftermath. And so, the discovery faded from memory. Patricia kept typing, kept working in the background, a silent cog in the wheel of history that would never know her name. The documents continued to flow across her desk, and the war was slowly, inevitably, forgotten. But the questions lingered. Had the information she had uncovered been important? Had it been buried because it was too dangerous to reveal, or because no one cared to listen? As the years went by, the faces in the office changed. New leaders, new priorities, and new crises arrived. The world moved on, but Patricia remained in the same place, a quiet observer of history, as the shadow of the war stretched longer into the past. Then came the day when everything began to shift again. It had been a typical morning, one of those days when the monotony of her work seemed to stretch endlessly before her. But this time, the call came unexpectedly. A reporter, young and eager, had come across a mention of her name while researching the history of the war. The piece of her life that had been long buried in the dark recesses of government archives was now being unearthed. The reporter was persistent, and after days of inquiries and phone calls, Patricia found herself at the center of a story she had long thought forgotten. The reporter had uncovered the truth. The document she had discovered in 1943 was far more significant than anyone had realized. It had been part of a much larger intelligence network, one that had intercepted critical communications from the enemy, information that could have changed the course of the war. Patricia's hunch, the one that had been dismissed as irrelevant, had in fact been a pivotal moment in intelligence history. But there was no celebration, no public recognition for Patricia. The story she had helped to uncover, the secret that had slipped through the cracks of history, was not one that could be allowed to disrupt the narrative that had been carefully crafted by those in power. No one in the higher echelons of government was willing to admit that an outsider, a typist, a woman with no credentials, had been the key to cracking the code that had eluded the most seasoned intelligence officers. The truth, as it often does, became a casualty of power. Instead, Patricia was met with silence. She was called in for a meeting with a few men from the government who spoke to her with the same detached formality that had been her constant companion for years. They told her that the story would be handled discreetly, that it was better for her to remain in the background. She was reminded of the danger of drawing attention to herself, of the importance of maintaining the status quo. The war was over, and the heroes had already been chosen. There was no room for her in their carefully constructed narrative.